Jednou u nás vítám Suzanu Lorin. Suzana je Chief Innovation and Research Officer ve FUNCE a současně je také člověk, který je v úzkém kontaktu s Evropskou komisí právě stran standardů a legislativy a přišla se s námi podělit o tady něco málo z této tématiky. So, Susanna, thank you very much for joining us this morning. We are really glad that you will share some of your know-how regarding standards and legislation, and the floor is yours. So, please, you can start both, I would say, sharing and talking about this topic.
Okay, thank you very much, Radek, and thank you for having me here. So I just listened in very shortly and I realized that I do not understand much of the Czech language, unfortunately, so I'm happy that somebody is going to translate for me. So I have only 30 minutes to go through the Web Accessibility Directive and also mention a little bit about the standard that goes together with the directive, and this is a very short time for quite a dense topic, so I will try to do my best, but I hope you won't faint from
a doufám, že z té záplavy slov
the interpretation. Then please let me know. So my name is Susanna Lorin. As Radek said, I'm the Chief Research and Innovation Officer at a small consultancy called Funke. I'm also a strategic advisor to the European Commission, and I have been leading the expert group of something called the WADEX, which is the Web Accessibility Expert Group on behalf of the European Commission. So if you find this legislation difficult or bad, then you can at least partly blame me because I wrote some of the implementation acts for the Commission. I'm also one of the 12 experts in the ETSI Special Task Force 536, and we are in charge of the standard that I will touch upon a little bit, which is the presumed minimum conformance for, so the minimum requirements for the Web Accessibility Directive. So if you find the standard difficult to understand, you can also blame me, at least partly. And I'm also one of the, I'm the representative for the industry organization, member organization IAAP, the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. I'm the representative to the EU. So if you're interested in that organization, I know Radek is also very active, but we are now doing a EU initiative launched today, actually. So there's also some information in the Czech language around that. So I am going to jump directly into the Web Accessibility Directive, but I want to say something about how what a directive is. The EU legislation on accessibility is based on the UNCRPD, the United Nations Convention for Rights of People with Disabilities. And then there is a disability strategy connected to that. And then there are the legal parts and research that sort of stems out of this. And one of the recent years' legislation is the Web Accessibility Directive. And a directive is the way this is constructed. The directive is a minimum harmonization directive, which means that all member states need to have the same basic legislation. So it's the same in all member states, but there are also possibilities for countries to go beyond the legislation. You can't do less, but you're welcome to do more. And that has happened in a couple of the member states have decided to widen the scope and do other kinds of specific details changed towards the sort of the local knowledge or tradition in that member state. And I know that one of Radek's colleagues will also look specifically into how the Czech Republic has, or both, I think, Czech and Slovak legislation, the national legislation has been transposed, because that's what it is. It's an EU directive. It's the same for everyone, but then you need to implement it in each member state. So there are small differences between the countries, or some of them, but the baseline is the same. The minimum requirements are the same in all member states. So the directive points to minimum requirements covered in
uvádí minimální počet
called the EN 301549. So it's a long number, but that is the European norm, the EN 301549. And the version that you would like to look at is not the last published version, but the version 2.1.2, because that is the version that has been harmonized and accepted by the European Commission. So the legislation is pointing to that specific standard. So the law tells you what is supposed to be accessible and who is going to be accessible, but the standard tells you exactly how. So this is the technical requirement, so to speak. And in the first annex, in Annex A of this standard, that's where we list the presumed conformance criteria. So that's a specific list on exactly what to read and how to do this. And you will get this presentation afterwards. And there is a link to this standard so that you can read it up on your own. So who is covered by the directive? Well, it's public sector, so local governments, regional governments, and national governments, all the public sector, but also publicly owned or led companies, and that what is called bodies governed by public law. So that is the easy way to say that is that there are organizations, and it doesn't matter if they are private or a foundation or how they are organized legally, but they need to be either owned to a majority by public sector or led by, directed by public sector to a majority. So usually that equals the organizations that are under the procurement directive. So if they need to procure things in the same way as the public sector does, then it's very likely that they're also covered by the Web Accessibility Directive. And what is going to be accessible here? What is in scope of this law? Well, it's the website, the external website, the intranets, the extranets, if they have extranets, documents that are published on these websites and intranets, and also the mobile apps. So essentially, this is kind of everything digital, all the digital services provided by the public sector body. There are, of course, some exceptions. There are always exceptions in legislation. And in this directive, the exceptions are live video recordings. So if you have a video and it's pre-recorded, then it needs to be accessible when you publish it online. But if you publish something directly, like a live recording, then it doesn't have to be accessible at the time when you send it. If you want to keep it online, which we usually do when we record something, we usually sort of keep it published afterwards, then it is considered to be pre-recorded after 2 weeks. So if you keep the recording for 2 weeks, then you need to make it accessible during this period of time. This may seem strange because people who need accessibility services, for example, in a video, people who are hard of hearing need captioning. And of course, if there's a live video sending something about the pandemic or the vaccine or something very sort of actual happening right now, of course, they want it to be accessible from the start and not in 2 weeks, because then it's no longer actual. So, but the reason for this is that when the directive was constructed and developed, at that time it was quite resource demanding to translate and make captioning in a good way. So the legislator thought, okay, this is too much to require, and we make it the pre-recorded one instead of the live one. I personally think that this is no longer the case because we have a lot of good automatic captioning these days, and also in many languages. So my personal guess will be that in a couple of years, probably even live video will be included in the directive. But as for now, live videos are accepted from this. Also, maps that are used for navigation are exempt from the legislation. And again, this is because it's very, very hard to create a map made for navigation, like a Google map style thing, that is 100% accessible for all users with different kinds of assistive technology, and specifically for blind users. So you don't need to make the map accessible, but it's required that you have an alternative. So this could be, for example, if you present information on where to get rid of the garbage or something like that from the local government side, then maybe that is presented in a map so that people can find their way there. But then you can, instead of trying to make the map totally accessible, which is very, very hard from a technical standpoint, then you can instead explain how to go there. You can say that there's a bus station and you can take the train, you can go there, and you can explain how to go. So there needs to be an alternative to the map navigation, but usually there is anyway some kind of text explanation on how to find your way. Also, heritage collections are exempt from the legislation, and that is because when we try to balance between what is important in the world, the legislator thought that, okay, we need to digitalize our heritage collections. Old manuscripts and transcripts are valuable, but they are now maybe deteriorating from humidity or age or things like that. And it's really important to save them to the next generations. It's really important that we make them digital in one way or another, so microfilms and so on. And making them accessible at the same time would be very, very costly. Again, there's no real sort of tool to make that happen in an efficient way. So that's why the legislator thought that it's still very important to make the heritage collections digital, but we can't require that they are made accessible in the same time. Also, third-party content is exempt from the regulations, and that is kind of obvious because if you have a chat function or a forum or something on your website, you can't be responsible for what other people publish. So if the public, the society, people from the well, anyone, the users, if they provide some content that is not accessible, that cannot be your fault or the responsibility of the public sector body. And we have some timelines for the directive. Most of these requirements, they're already in place because it was the 23rd of September last year in 2020, where was the major sort of grace period. So the website, the extranets, the documents, the intranets need to be accessible as of the 23rd of September 2020. This legislation was decided already in or approved in 2016, and then it entered into force in 2018. So we have had a long time to adhere to this regulation. So since September last year, most of the items covered by the legislation need to be accessible. But for the mobile apps, you still have until the 23rd of June this year. So it's another 1.5 months to make sure that the mobile apps are accessible. And the reason why the apps came later on is that originally the apps were not included in the legislation, so it came in later. And also at the time where we developed the legislation, the directive, at that time, no one could really foresee how exactly the apps should be monitored. So that was kind of a technical problem, not for making them accessible, but for the monitoring agencies to make sure that we could control that they are actually accessible. And that's why we gave the member states another 9 months to make that happen. But now it's soon to be there. And then everything needs to be accessible. It's also important to understand that the directive is pointing to the future. So you're not supposed to look back and try to fix old things. That's much more important that you learn how to do things well now and make sure that you have processes and routines to make it accessible in the future so that you keep making things accessible onwards. So documents that are published before the legislation entered into force, 23rd of September 2018, they do not have to be accessible. You can forget about them. Hopefully nobody wants them anymore and you can take them down. Also archived material that has not been changed until after the 23rd of September 2019, which is a year after the legislation came into force, they also do not have to be accessible. And when it comes to the intranets, if they were published before the 23rd of September in 2019, you don't need to touch them until they are undergoing a major revision. So you don't need to make them accessible in one go, but the next time you update or upgrade or redesign your intranet, then you need to make them accessible. So that's kind of the interfaces that need to be accessible and the technical requirements. And that's usually where people start. Actually, you can't just relax after doing that, because there are also some other requirements for public sector bodies. Every public sector body covered by this legislation need to publish an accessibility statement. For each of the items that are covered by the law, you need to have a statement. In that statement, you need to describe the level of accessibility, but you also need to provide a possibility for users that cannot use your website for some reason. If something is not accessible, then you need to be able to provide alternative formats. You also need to provide a feedback mechanism so that end users can tell you if something is not accessible and ask about how they are going to go about to get the alternative format delivered. And you also need to link to a complaints mechanism. So the first step is a feedback mechanism where the public sector body talks directly to the end user and hopefully solves any problem there. If that doesn't go well, then the user had the chance to go to the next step and really complain about the behavior of the non-accessible website. And then the monitoring agency or the ombudsman or another legal entity in the member state can then take this complaint to court and control what has happened and make sure that the public sector body is doing what it's supposed to do according to the legislation. The accessibility statement is required to be detailed, comprehensive, and clear. 3 small words that are very hard to achieve. If it should be detailed and comprehensive, it means it should be huge, because if you have a large website on a local government website could have 30,000 pages or something, then if you need to state everything that is not accessible there, maybe that will be a very, very long report. In the same time, it needs to be clear. So how do you make very complex and very long, lengthy and detailed and granular information also very clear? That's the balance. And why is it written this way? It's because there are 2 target audiences for the accessibility statement. And the primary target audience are the end users. I am a low vision user and I don't want to try to use a website that is not accessible. The idea is that I can go to the accessibility statement and I can see, okay, that service won't work for me. Now I know that. I don't need to try and be angry myself or frustrated. I can ask for something in an alternative format instead. So the end users are the primary target audience for the accessibility statement. The secondary target audience is the monitoring agency. The monitoring agency in the member state need to be able to see how is the accessibility statement produced? Is it updated? Is it providing the truth? and is this public sector body doing what they're supposed to do according to the legislation? And that's why you need to have the detailed report talking about everything. I personally recommend that to be in a separate document and the accessibility statement to be short and sweet and clear and more aimed at the end users. That is much more efficient. In the accessibility statement, you need to say what is inaccessible and why. So if everything is accessible, you can just write, we are accessible, fine, then it's easy. But many public sector bodies still have something, some part or some service that is not 100% compliant to the legislation. And then you need to point out what is not accessible, in what way is it not accessible? Maybe it's not accessible for just one specific target audience or one specific use case. And then you also need to explain that this is inaccessible because we are going to update it in 2 months. So there's just a timing problem. We will get there soon, or maybe there is a technical problem right now, or we are stuck in some kind of system, making it very difficult to get to the next level, and therefore we deem it to be disproportionate burden. It's too cumbersome, too resource demanding to do this now. We will do it the next time when we do an upgrade instead, for example. You are also going to provide information on how to get the alternative formats for the user. And if you want to claim disproportionate burden, that is where you do it. You document in your accessibility statement that this part of the website is inaccessible, and we claim disproportionate burden. And I'll come back to what that means. So the disproportionate burden is something you need to prove, or at least make probable that it's actually true, that it is a disproportionate burden. And when the monitoring agency is going to control if it's true that it is in fact a disproportionate burden or not, which means should you make it accessible, or is it okay that it's not accessible, then they look at the size, the resources, and the nature of the organization in scope of the directive. So a small local government usually has less resources than a large national agency, for example. And so that's how they look at the resources and sizes, what kind of human resources and what kind of budget do they have. And also the nature. If it's an organization, a public sector body dealing with unemployment or social security or health, then it's extremely important to every user. But there are agencies that are less relevant to each and every citizen in their everyday life. There are agencies who are more servicing other agencies, for example. So also how important is the content here for the regular citizen? Then they look at the cost and benefits. So how much does it actually cost to do this? And if you make the remediation, how many people would it benefit? How much bigger would the benefit be? And so on. And they would look at the two perspectives, both for the benefits for the agency as such and for the citizens. So that is also something that needs to be balanced. And then the last point to look at is the frequency and duration. If it's, for example, a service where I require payment for social security when I am at home with my children because they're ill, that is maybe something parents do quite often, unfortunately, at least these days. So that has a frequency and also a long duration. But to compare that with what a service where I, for example, I apply for building a new house. Maybe that is something I do once in my lifetime, or maybe twice in my lifetime, but at least not as often as I claim to get this parental leave money. So then that is sort of less important from the citizen point of view. So that is another weighing exercise done. So if the if the action is going to be deemed as disproportionate burden, then all of these points need to be taken into account and distributed in a reasonable way. So what does this mean really for the public sector bodies? Well, first of all, you need to know your status. You need to know the state of the art of your digital interfaces, because to be able to produce an accessibility statement, you need to know if your website or app or documents are accessible. And to do that, you can use different ways, of course. You can, when you procure your digital services, you can pose requirements on your suppliers so that you know that whatever you provide is always accessible. And you can have internal processes making sure that you never publish anything that is inaccessible, because you have a quality assurance system and you have routines internally that makes it impossible to publish without the accessibility in mind. There are authoring tools, for example, where you simply can't publish an image without writing an alternative text, for example. If you don't have those processes at hand now, then you can, of course, do testing. So the other way of doing accessibility checks is you have your object that needs to be accessible, and then you do the testing. So you look at the standard and all the minimum criteria, and you test and see, is this fulfilled or not? So that's just the internal checking. That can be done, of course, internally if you have a competence in-house, which is very good to have, because otherwise you will need to pay extra for this service. So it's very important that you sort of build internal competence. If you don't have this competence in-house, which may be the case if this is kind of new, I know that in the Czech Republic there has been already legislation on web accessibility, so hopefully most public sector bodies already have internal competencies. But if you don't, then you may need to ask an external expert company to come in and do the testing for you. That can, of course, be very good because you get a sort of objective picture of this, but it is costly and it's also not building your internal competence. So I would recommend to try to make sure to keep as much as possible internal, if possible. And a combination is often maybe required, because even if you do have internal competence, then sometimes you stumble over something that is new, or you have never seen this technology or this gadget before, and then you would need your external expert to support you. I would also recommend to really take the feedback mechanism seriously. Strangely enough, we find that some public sector bodies say, oh, we don't really want that. They seem to find it a problem when the users come to them with their explanations about problems and so on. But really, the end users with disabilities, they are the real experts here. So you can really learn from them. And if you handle the feedback you get from the end users in a good way, then this is mostly, hopefully, the most constructive and efficient way to do remediations of accessibility. Provided, of course, that you get constructive input. If they just say that your website is bad, then you haven't really learned anything. But hopefully they can tell you what is the problem and where is the problem and why is it a problem, and then you can really do something about it. So that's extremely good. So you can look at it as kind of free consultation. Instead of asking us or someone else to help you and get paid for it, you can just make sure that you take care of the feedback you get from end users and turn that into knowledge and improvement of accessibility. If the feedback doesn't work, then the end user has the possibility to escalate this errand to the monitoring agency or ombudsman, or the agency who's taking care of complaints that can differ between different member states. So, and usually it's required that the user have started with communicating to the specific public sector body. So the feedback is sort of the first phase. But if the public sector body doesn't answer or reply within a reasonable time, which is kind of 2 working weeks, more or less, or if the reply is not sufficient, then the end user has the possibility to go to this complaints agency and say, hey, you need to look at this. Look, my local government here, they are not compliant with the directive. And if the monitoring agency then agrees with the user and say that, yes, this should have been accessible, but it's not, they would probably give you a certain amount of time to remediate this. But if you don't solve it, then you risk being fined, because there are penalties attached to the Web Accessibility Directive, or rather there's a possibility or opportunity for the monitoring agencies to also work with penalties. Again, that is decided on the national level, and it's usually based on the tradition and how other similar legal tracks work. But that is the sort of ultimate, the end of the complaints, feedback and complaints. If you don't follow the recommendations from the monitoring agency, then you risk getting a penalty. So when the whole discussion about legislation on web accessibility started, we from Funka, we were quite skeptic. And I still don't believe legislation is the best way to move things forward when it comes to accessibility. And people tend to think that is strange, because usually it's the accessibility experts, they like legislation because it makes them get more assignments and earn more money. But I personally think that there are better ways to make this happen. So I didn't sort of push this through. But now, after having worked with the legislation for many, many years and still doing it, I have started to believe in the directive, that it's really quite cleverly put together. And the three keys that I see for successful implementation and enforcement of this legislation is the combination of enforcement procedures. So we have the national monitoring. Every member state needs to have a monitoring agency looking into, like, the policing from the top-down perspective, looking at what the public sector agencies are actually doing. And then we have sort of the bottom-up perspective. The users, they give the feedback and they can give complaints as well. So you have the user, the real users, the beneficiaries of the legislation, they can also have a say and should be involved. And in the middle, you have the self-declaration, just as you do your tax declaration. Here you have the accessibility statement. And that means that all the public sector bodies, they need to understand what they're doing. If they're going to provide and publish something that someone responsible needs to sign off and say, yeah, this is the status of accessibility, that means that they need to take it seriously. So after working with this for a long time, I've started thinking that this might actually work quite well, and hopefully it will make the world more accessible, because that is, of course, the ultimate goal of this legislation. Interestingly enough, we are right now working with the WAD review, so the Web Accessibility Directive review. And that may seem a little early, but it's actually written in the original directive text that this review is going to happen now. So in parallel with the member states reporting back to the Commission about their first monitoring period, we, together with the PricewaterhouseCoopers and Open Evidence, are performing the review of the Web Accessibility Directive. It's a long assignment. We're working for 1.5 years, but we are going to look into all the reporting and what is happening, and we are going to ask public sector bodies and end users and all other stakeholders what they think. So stay tuned for the open public consultation that will come during the summer period, where you can really have your say and explain to the Commission how they should improve or change the directive. And we will also do targeted interviews with the selection of stakeholders to get many perspectives, of course. But the open public consultation is really something that I urge everyone to engage in, because this is where we can really get all the different perspectives and impact on the next sort of update, potential update of the Web Accessibility Directive. So that was my 30 minutes, and I hope we can have some questions.
Yes, we have. Thank you very much, Susanna. The question is that there are various service providers in Slovakia regarding information system, both intranet and extranet. And when you when you do some acquisition of the system, and this acquisition is paid by European money, it's, for example, some project funded by the European Union, the question is how to proceed in a case that the result, the system is not accessible, it's not delivered according to standards. I mean, it's not accessible according to the Accessibility Directive. So who is the right person to ask, or which institution should be contacted, both on national and also on, let's say, international level, on the UA level?
Well, I think one of the really important parts of making things accessible is to post the right requirements. So when you procure or even buy something, I think that is when you need to use the EN standard and not just say, we would like a website and please make it nice and accessible, because that won't work. Because you don't know exactly what you are requiring. You need to have very, very clear and specific requirements. And there are really good parts of the standard. The Annex B is really where you can choose exactly which requirements, or you can see which requirements is connected to what parts of the functional performance statements and so on. So there are really good ways of posing clear requirements. If you have told the supplier that this standard is what we are going to acquire the system from, then it's the supplier who needs to follow the whatever you have decided on in the contract. And if you write the contract that if it's not accessible, then we won't pay. So that is how usually this is done. That you balance accessibility with, like, if the supplier is delayed, you may not pay 100%. So if it's not accessible, you shouldn't pay 100% either. If you didn't require them to sell something that is accessible to you, then the problem is on you, unfortunately, because the way that Web Accessibility Directive is written, it's the public sector body who has the responsibility. So if you buy, purchase, procure something that is not accessible, that is really on you. So that's why you need to be very, very clear when you do your purchases and your procurement, the tenders, the call for tenders, that you always really state that this needs to be accessible.
Ďakujem. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions regarding legislation or standards? If not, so I have one. What's your experience regarding this legislation and universities and, let's say, schools in general? Maybe you know that in our country the legislation is not so strong regarding schools and universities as it should be. Do you have any overview or idea how is this in other European countries?
Yeah, that's the schools and kindergarten, and also the learning material. That is one of the points where the directive leaves a little room for interpretation. So quite a few of the member states have chosen to sort of go a little bit lower when it comes to the learning environments and so on. I have a very sort of patchy picture of this. There are some countries where they really push for accessibility in the university system based on what is happening in the US, for example. And there are also other countries where they have a specific or several specific laws when it comes to the educational system and accessibility. So that's sort of already covered, even if the directive is not covering it. So I would say the situation differs quite a lot between different member states, but it's always a problem. I'm just now writing a report for one of the universities in Holland, who asked me to, well, they wrote a report themselves trying to interpret the legislation, and then they want me to look at it and see if the interpretation is right or not. And I think that sort of points to something that is not perfect. It's much easier if everyone knows what is the regulation, because now it's really, what if we do this? I mean, the external website, yes, and the sort of the most relevant thing should be accessible, but then when you have learning material and so on, then it's really more or less up to the university. And I think that is a pity. The idea with providing that flexibility is that each member state should have the possibility to do something according to the tradition and culture and other legislation and so on. So I understand the reasoning why, but I think really when the legislation becomes this fluffy, you are not really helping anyone. It's much easier if it's very sort of square and strict. So I would say there is a lot of worry specifically in lower level grades. I would say universities, the most of the ones that we know of, they work fairly well with accessibility, and they have learned also from the pandemic, the sort of forced digitalization that everyone was into. I would say generally it's a bigger problem in the lower level education system, where usually the resources are not that big, and also many teachers are not very digital in the first place. I mean, now speaking very broadly. And so I would say that is maybe a bigger problem in general terms. But again, it does differ a lot between different countries. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can imagine that say the impact of this directive is really wide, and you have kindergartens on one side and universities on the other. But what I experience sometimes is that universities try to pretend that they are kindergartens in terms of Web Accessibility Directive, and that's that's the point. Yeah, that they have resources,
nice try.
they have money, they have everything, but they try to pretend that they are just a small school with one headmistress and two teachers, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, really, the whole reason for this kindergarten thing, the exemption, is that the legislature didn't want to lower the creativity for children, so that if in a kindergarten the children are, I don't know, playing around with their phones and doing videos, or they are maybe drawing pictures and they want to publish it online, that shouldn't be required to be accessible, because that could sort of had a barrier for creativity. That was the original idea behind this, the whole reasoning behind. So it was never the idea that a university or even a secondary school would not have accessible training material, because that is, in most countries at least, required by the legislation anyway. It's just not that well enforced. So
yeah, thank you. And the last question is regarding the public procurement, and the question is whether you think that the referencing, the norm you mentioned is sufficient, or whether you would recommend to do more, like being more specific. What's your experience and recommendation?
I think it depends a little bit on what you procure, because there's a difference if you procure a system or if you procure a service. And if you procure a service, then you are trying to buy something that doesn't exist. And what you actually procure then is like your service provider or a supplier who is going to hold your hand and, you know, walk together with you to produce something. So, and then it may be more relevant to ask for their competence and if they are certified, for example, or if they have education, if they have a system where they constantly test things with users and things like that. So that could be more relevant if you procure services. If you do procure an IT system of some sort, then it should be enough to reference to the EN standard and Annex A. It's never a bad idea to sort of, you know, really write out every line. It depends on how big you want to make this, of course, but if the supplier is telling you that yes, we are compliant, or our product is compliant to the EN standard, then go for it. I mean, that's really good, and we see more and more of that happening. We have been doing a couple of reports and investigations after the procurement directive entered into force in 2017. And really the reference to the EN standard has more or less exploded. And we see most of the sort of larger ICT procurements, they are referencing accessibility in one way or another. So this is really happening. It's kind of slow, but it is happening. And the good thing is that means that the procurement directive and the web accessibility directive both only cover public sector, and the disability community thinks that is really small. Why did you do it that way? But the good thing is that all the ICT producers and suppliers and developers and designers, they want to sell to public sector. So of course, they also learn accessibility. And we can see that in our own numbers. I have been working at Funka since 2003, so I have a lot of statistics, and we have been having our ICT companies have been 2 to 3% of our clients for 20 years. And after the procurement directive became known in the autumn of 2016, we started to see a very clear increase in the number of clients coming from the ICT sector. And now we have around 27% of our clients are ICT suppliers. And that's not, I can assure you, that's not because they all of a sudden woke up and thought they should be nice to people with disabilities. it's because of the directives.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you very much for both sharing your insights as well as for being here with us. We were really glad, and thank you also for answering, I would say, very interesting